Good afternoon. Welcome to Ziggy's World, and I'm Ziggy. And today I've got MSP Murdo Fraser, and we're going to be discussing his latest paper on the reforming of Parliament. Good afternoon, Murdo. How are you?
Good afternoon, Mark. I'm well. Thank you for having me back on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Great, thanks. First, before we get into the reforming of Parliament, a number of people have asked about Michael Matheson and what is the latest, any latest developments on when this report's coming out, or?
Sure. Well, as people might remember, what happened was the Parliament's corporate body, which is the group who oversee the running of Parliament and pay all the bills, referred the issue with his use of his iPad to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, whose job it is to basically investigate breaches of the Code of Conduct and to recommend any sanctions that are appropriate. It's been with them. My understanding is they have investigated this. They have spoken to Matheson. We expect a report from them in the very near future. It might even happen this week. And we will know at that point what they recommend, whether they are planning to impose a sanction, which could be, for example, a reprimand, or it could be a suspension from Parliament for whatever period they deem appropriate. Now, I have no more information than that, I'm afraid. And I know people, outside looking in, think these things take a long time, and they do. But of course, there are legal and employment issues which have to be considered. So nobody can rush into this. So my advice would be patient.
Just a matter of time before it comes out. Brilliant. Thanks for that, Murdo. Now, onto the subject of Parliament and your paper on reforming Parliament. Before, I must admit, I'm not the biggest fan of devolution. I've never been. I didn't vote for devolution. I'm not the biggest fan. But I do understand and I do realise it's been 25 years now since we had Scottish Parliament, and it's not going anywhere. So instead of concentrating on sending the powers back to Westminster and ending devolution, which a lot of people are starting to talk about, I've heard quite a few now discussing this, having a conversation about this. So, but I know it's not going to happen. There's no appetite at Westminster for this, and there's no appetite in Scottish Parliament for this, and it's just not going to happen. So I would rather concentrate on what we can do right now, and that is reform Parliament. Now, you've come up with a paper for 25 reforms into Parliament. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, Mark, just on that first point you made, you, like me, will see the social media response when I post about parliamentary reform. The biggest chunk of answers that come back are from people saying you should just abolish Holyrood altogether, and that's just not going to happen. It is a cul-de-sac. No Westminster government is going to do that, and I think the latest polling said somewhere less than 20% of people in Scotland would support it. So I'm afraid, whatever view you take on that, that is just not going to happen, and there's no point wasting our energy on that. The other thing I deliberately stayed away from in this paper is looking at the whole issue of the powers that Holyrood has. Now, in my view, I don't support transferring more powers to Holyrood. Some people obviously do support that. SNP clearly do support that, but that's not what this is about. This is about reforming Holyrood to make it work better. And I think after 25 years is a good point to do that and say, what have we learned from 25 years of devolution? Is the institution working as well as it should? And I think if you look at all the commentary there has been in the papers over the last couple of weeks from right across the political spectrum, people like Jack McConnell, former First Minister from Labour, the current presiding officer, Alan Johnson, who's a Green, amongst others, people are saying there are clear institutional weaknesses in Holyrood that need to be tackled. Now, my paper takes as a starting point, there are two major failings in Holyrood as it currently stands. The first is in relation to the legislative process. There is too much bad law coming out of Holyrood. And by bad law, I don't mean laws you or I might disagree with. I mean laws that are technically deficient or which end up being challenged by the courts or end up being repealed. So give you three examples. Offensive Behaviour at Football Act was heavily criticised by the judiciary, who said it was unworkable. One sheriff said it was mint. That ended up being repealed by the Parliament. The named person policy was challenged and struck down by the Supreme Court. And the Gender Reform Act, passed by Parliament, struck down by the UK government using Section 35 powers. That decision by UK government upheld by a Scottish court. So three examples, and there have been others, three examples of bad laws where, with a proper and improved scrutiny mechanism, we would have had better legislation. So that's the first area. And the second area, and again it overlaps, is the ability of MSPs who are not in government to hold government ministers to account.
Yeah.
So if you're an MSP like myself, I'm not in government, but my job is to represent my constituents, get answers from them, from the government, probe into what government is doing, shine a light on it. And our ability to do that is constrained by the current processes and procedures of Holyrood. So my reforms, 25, as you say, are focused around these two areas: improving legislation and better scrutiny of government.
I've picked out a couple. You've just mentioned one of the main points is the bad law. I'd like to go to the presiding officer and the presiding officer's role. Now, as I see it, I think the presiding officer has very limited powers in Holyrood, far too limited. And my second issue is that, in my view, the presiding officer's position should never be somebody whose party has been in government, like we've seen with the Greens. And I know she gives up her position and she's supposed to be independent, the presiding officer we have now, but it's not what we're seeing. It doesn't come across as she's been being independent at all. And I don't believe, I think there's it doesn't sit well that the Greens, who have up until recently been in government for the last year, has a presiding officer who judges on it, because it becomes very evident her position. In my view, it should always be an opposition person from the opposition, maybe someone from Labour, someone from Conservatives, someone from Liberal, who's in opposition to the government, should be in the presiding officer's role. That's my position. But I also see, and I'd like your opinion on this, is the government ministers being held accountable. We've seen far too many times where the government ministers stand up to give false information. They lie. They've been caught lying. We've seen Humza being caught lying. We've seen Matheson obviously being caught lying. Far too ministers, and there's no. The presiding officer says it's up to the minister to come back, correct the record, and apologise if they want to. That, to me, is not good enough, and I think it's the trust issue becomes eroded when ministers stand up in Parliament and openly lie, and it's quite obvious that, there's lied. So, what do you believe? What do you think? Do you think that needs to change?
So the simple answer to that question is yes, and that my paper covers that explicitly. Now, to be fair to the current presiding officer, current standing orders do not permit her to require ministers to ask the question. So, it's not that she's just doing it for political reasons, it's just doesn't have that power. Now, I think it's quite interesting. If you watch the House of Commons and you watch Lindsay Hoyle, who is the Speaker of the House of Commons, he strikes me as being much more forceful with ministers in requiring them to respond to questions and calling out ministers where they haven't done that. So I would like to see that change at Holyrood. So the presiding officer has the opportunity to say to a minister, for example, well, the answer you've just given has nothing to do with the question that you've been asked. I require you to actually give an answer to that question.
Yeah, because we've seen, as sorry for interrupting, but we've seen, and especially from the Conservatives, when the Conservatives ask a question of the First Minister at questions time, the number of times the First Minister, Runda and Spurgeon both have said it is, don't answer the question, but I will take no lessons from the Conservative Party that Scott Morris is its leader. We heard that time and time again, and refusing to answer the question. Surely the presiding officer should step in and say, the question wasn't about that. Can you answer the question? Because that's what he's there to answer questions.
Yeah. So I think that's a very fair point. The second thing is in my paper is around the timetabling of parliamentary business. So at present, virtually the entire parliamentary week is timetabled by what's called the Parliamentary Bureau, which is made up of representatives of all the parties. In practice, that means the government controls parliamentary business, apart from the time that's allocated to opposition parties. So as Conservatives, we have an afternoon roughly once a month when we can pick the topic for debate. But apart from that, the government sets the agenda. And I would like to see the presiding officer having more power to set the timetable. And if there's a topical issue that comes up, for the presiding officer to say, right, we're going to have a debate on this afternoon, and you say it's on education, you, the education secretary, have to come to the chamber and speak on this, rather than have the government, in effect, decide for itself when it's going to bring topics up. Because otherwise, you don't have the spontaneity. And what Parliament should be there for is to allow MSPs from the opposition and backbench government MSPs to be able to get ministers there to answer their questions. And that's not happening often enough.
Do you think committee systems are strong enough as well? Do you think they need strengthening in committee?
Sorry, Mark, you broke up a little bit there. I missed that.
Sorry, I don't know what, I think it's the sound, but committee system. Do you think the committee system needs changed? Yeah,
so this is something, in fact, that's already being looked at. So that the Parliamentary Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee is already looking at this question of having elected conveners. Now, what happens at the moment is that at the start of each Parliament, the committee convenerships are divided up between the parties based on the proportion of MSPs they have. So, for example, the Conservatives, we have 31 out of 129 MSPs. So we have the convenership, I think, of four, maybe 5 committees out of 60. But who gets to be the convener is decided by the party leader. So, I don't want to personalise this, but if you're Douglas Ross's chum, he says, right, you can be the convener of that committee. And the proposal is that we move to a position of elected conveners, which would allow the Parliament as a whole to elect people to chair committees. This is what happens in Westminster. It's happened in Westminster for years. And what it does is it allows more independently minded voices to chair committees rather than just people who are there to represent the party leadership, or in the case of the government view. So if you can imagine looking at the Parliament at the moment and somebody like, say, Fergus Ewing, who's a very outspoken SNP backbencher, if you had an elected committee convenership system, people might say, well, let's have Fergus chairing a committee from the SNP because he's somebody far more likely to use that position objectively rather than just being there to try and protect ministers. Yeah. So, and also I think if you elected conveners of committees, they would then have a status and an accountability within the Parliament to a greater extent than they currently have. So I think that would be a very, very positive in terms of strengthening the role of the committees.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly. Do you think? I know there's a conversation now about a number of MSPs in Parliament. Do you think we need more? Because I don't. I personally think it's a little bit too big in my view. But do you think we do need more? I know there's a quite.
I'm not at all convinced of the argument for more. I mean, you can always argue perhaps we need fewer, but I would actually look at this issue from the other end of the telescope. I think the problem with the Parliament is government has got too big.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. Yeah.
If you look at Hamza Yusuf's government, if you add up the number of MSPs who were ministers, and you add into that the office holders, so the presiding officer and deputy presiding officers, we had, I think, nearly 30 MSPs who were either in government or office holders, out of a Parliament of 129. Now, that's far too many.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, John Swinney has reduced the overall number of ministers, I think, by 2 or 3 since he came in. But I still think government's too big. So I would like to see a cap on the number of ministers. And again, Westminster does this. There's a cap on the number of ministers who can be paid at Westminster, and the government can't exceed that. I'd like to see a cap on the number of ministers, maybe about 20. I think it's sufficient. And that means then there are more backbenchers. Because when people talk about not having enough MSPs, what they really mean is there aren't enough non-government MSPs whose job it is to hold the government to account and to staff the committees. Yeah. So personally, I'm not in favour of more MSPs. I think you deal with the problem by having fewer ministers.
Because we have what? We've got 11 cabinet ministers. We have 14 ministers and 2 law officers.
Yeah.
And we used to, under Hamza, we had an extra 3 green ministers' roles that were made up, and an independence minister that's now gone. So,
that's right.
Yeah, and when you look through the ministers' portfolios and what they have, some of them go into other areas that another. For instance, I have here a minister for children and the promise. I've no idea what that promise is because it doesn't say anything about it, but it has for children. Now, surely that can come under education. The Minister for Education can deal with that. So it doesn't, I think the roles are, and some of the roles are outside devolution as well.
Yeah.
So
classic example is Angus Robertson, who's the Minister for the Constitution and External Affairs. Now, we don't need a devolved administration having a Minister for the Constitution, which is a reserved matter, and External Affairs, which is a reserved matter. We don't need that. It's an unnecessary department. External Affairs and the Constitution should be run by Westminster. So you're absolutely right. There are savings to be made there, and pre-devolution, the old Scotland office was run by, I think, 5 or 6 ministers, and to be honest, run pretty effectively by 5 or 6 ministers. And you'd wonder, why on earth do we need 25, 26, whatever it is now? I'm not sure Scotland's in a much better place from having 5 times the number of ministers that we used to have.
See, my view on that is it's the SNP acting like a separate country rather than a devolved administration. I think it's the way they think. Well, if we had a vote in 2014, but let's just ignore that vote and let's act like a separate country, and let's have ministers that rival the same number of ministers at Westminster. And if we do that, we'll basically telling everybody we are a government and we are a separate country. That's the way I've seen the way they've they've dealt with this murder, I think.
Yeah, sure. The other element to this, Mark, is this all comes at enormous cost, because you're not just paying these ministers, you're paying for all their aides, special advisors, media advisors, additional civil servants for each minister. So every time you create a new minister, it's not just the salary of the minister, it's all the additional costs that come with that. But if you're in the government, you see, this is the way you reward people. Because if you're a junior minister in the Scottish Government, on top of your basic salary as an MSP, you get a salary, I think it's up to about 25,000, even for a junior minister, on top of your basic MSP salary. So you're earning nearly 100,000 as a junior minister. And that's a way of you being the first minister of rewarding people in your party who are loyal to you and do the things you want by paying them from the taxpayers' money.
Yeah, exactly. How I know yourself and the Conservatives are fully behind reform in Parliament. I do realise, I think Labour are also wanting it reformed, and I think there is cross-bench work on this, isn't there? I believe. How do you think it will be reformed? Because I think it has to be, hasn't it?
Yeah. So what I think is really interesting, Mark, is I think there is a consensus things need to change. People accept that the Scottish Parliament is not working as well as it should be. And what I've tried to do in this paper is set out 25 practical changes that could be made to make it work better. And I've written today to both the presiding officer and to Martin Whitfield, who's the chair of the Standards and Procedures Committee, saying I want to sit down and have a chat with them about how we make some of this happen. Now, of the 25 proposals I've published, I'll just check. So 9 of them would require a change to legislation. So the Scotland Act, which is the Westminster Act that created the Scottish Parliament, would need to be amended to implement 9 of these. But the remainder of the other 16 just require a change in standing orders or Parliament procedures. So that could be done relatively easily. And I think I'm pushing an open door here. And when I wrote my paper, Jack McConnell, Lord McConnell, who is the former Labour First Minister and who chairs Reform Scotland, who are the think tank which published the paper, wrote a forward for it very positively about what I was proposing. So I think there's a lot of cross-party interest in some of these changes. Whether they will happen while we still have an SNP administration is a different question. We might have to wait until 2026 and hopefully a change in the makeup of government at that point to get some of this done. But I'm absolutely clear that something's going to change. Brilliant.
I think that's it, Murdo. Thank you for joining me today. I do think we've had a little bit of issue with the sound. I'm not quite sure. I'm not the most technical person, so I'm not sure what that was. But I'll try and fix it. So, but thank you for joining me, giving your time up, and explaining this paper. And I think it is a really important issue that going forward that this does get implemented, because I think things do need to change. So thank you for that, Murdo, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. And I would say to anybody watching, I really welcome feedback. So please get in touch via social media, via my email, if there are particular comments you have about the paper. If you've not read it, you can find it on the Reform Scotland website. Perhaps you could put a link up to it, Mark, in the notes so people can see it. Please feedback. By all means, express the view that you want Holyrood to be abolished, which is where we started. But as I said at the very outset, I don't think that's going to happen. So let's try and concentrate on how we make the institution work better.
Yeah, completely agree.
The job of MSPs more effective.
Brilliant. So as Murdo said, please leave your comments on here or on Murdo's account, and we'll pass them on to Murdo. So thank you very much for joining us, Murdo, and I'll speak again.
Thanks again. Thanks,
Cheers.
Mark.
Thanks a lot.